All right, here we go. Analysis of variance, introduction to factorial ANOVA. Although this is a different tutorial, I've kept the numbering because it is all ANOVA. So introduction to factorial ANOVA. Factorial ANOVA, two-factor ANOVA is what we're going to look at, specifically two-factor between subjects ANOVA. Factorial ANOVA is not limited to just two factors. It can handle two or more factors. It gets a lot more complicated with more than two, so we'll just stick with two, as that's the most common design. Factor, again, also known as an independent variable or a grouping variable. With a one-factor design, we were comparing means across two or more groups. For example, we had bulimia treatment, a control group, cognitive behavioral therapy group, and a psychodynamic therapy group. Those individual groups are called levels of the factor. With a two-factor design, we have two different ways to break down the groups. We could have, for example, factor A, the type of treatment, again, with those same types of groups. And then factor B, length of treatment. We could have in each of those groups, half the people getting 3 sessions, half the people getting 10 sessions. This is going to allow us to ask a lot more questions, and I think that's something that we'll see really maps on nicely to, I think, probably a lot of the stuff you've learned in intro psych about psychological theory and psychological knowledge. Now, when we do factorial ANOVA, we get two different types of effects. We get the effects of the individual factors, which are commonly called the main effects, which is a misleading name because they're not the most interesting things. But we also get what's called an interaction effect, the combination effect, a combination of the effects of two different factors. This might fit on really well the stuff that you learned, like I said, in intro psych. For example, in intro psych, we talk a lot about person and situation. And what's the answer? Which is more important? The answer is always, of course, and this is with just about any question within psychology, it depends. Interactions are really exciting, and they are extremely prominent in psychology because what an interaction demonstrates is that it depends effect. So interactions really fit onto what a lot of our theories and a lot of our results tell us. So main effect, differences in scores on the dependent variable, the outcome variable, that can be attributed to a single factor. These are just differences in means, very much like what we looked at in the one-factor ANOVA. We just have two of them. We just have one for each of our factors in this case. So there'll be two main effects when we have two factors. Then that interaction, that's the combination effect. Differences of scores on the outcome that aren't attributable to just where they are on one of the factors versus another. It's that combination of scores on the factor. I'll give an example of that in a second. We're going to get multiple null hypotheses here. First time we've seen that. We're going to get one for each main effect and one for the interaction. So two main effects, one interaction. And again, that phrase main effect shouldn't be taken to be that's the main thing we're looking at. It doesn't mean it in that way. In fact, it's usually the interaction that we're far more interested in because of our, because of the it depends nature of our science. All right, just to compare what things might look like and some of the same things that you get with a two-factor ANOVA. With a one-factor ANOVA, we might drop 50 people in each of these three groups for 150 people overall and be able to answer one question. With a two-factor ANOVA, we could have those same 50 people and still have 50 in control and 50 in cognitive behavioral and 50 in psychodynamic. But if we break them down further by another factor, this being the length of treatment, we can answer questions about the type of therapy, about the length of treatment, and whether certain treatments work better in short versus long-term situations. So that's going to give us the ability to answer questions like, well, does cognitive behavioral therapy work? It depends. Does psychodynamic theory work? Potentially, it depends. What does it depend on? Potentially, it depends on the length of the treatment. When we have factorial ANOVA, we have more means to talk about. We have the overall mean for the control group, the overall mean for cognitive behavioral therapy, the overall mean for psychodynamic theory, and I've just labeled psychodynamic, and I've just labeled those X bar A1 A2 and A3 to denote the different levels of factor A. We have the overall mean for short-term and long-term. And I've labeled those X bar B1 and X bar B2. Those A means go into the testing of the main effect of factor A. The B means go into the testing of factor B. We also have a third kind of mean, a mean for each of these six individual combinations, control group short-term, control group long-term, and so on. I've just called those cell means. I could have put in A1, B1, A1, B2. I think the notation gets a little brutal there. So we're just going to call those the cell means. So if we have a factor with 3 levels and a factor with 2 levels, we'll have 6 cell means. A factor with 3 levels and a factor with also 3 levels would have 9 cell means. It's just the number of levels times each other, which will give you the number of combinations that we have. We'll see that those cell means are going to be used in certain computations. The B means and the A means are going to be used in other computations. So compared to the one-factor ANOVA, there's some similarities, but there's some extensions. We're still starting off by taking sums of square total and breaking it into sums of square between and sums of square within. That's still the core of every ANOVA. However, with the two-factor ANOVA, we're not interested in that sums of square between group. We're not interested in testing that. We actually end up breaking that down into sums of square A, sums of square B, and sums of square that's attributable to the interaction. Once we have those individual sums of squares, you'll see that things play out just like the one-factor ANOVA, where we're going to have degrees of freedom, mean squares, and eventually F values. It's exactly the same thing as one factor. There's just more stuff going on. All right, so let's take a look at the therapy example before we move to some data. So for the therapy example, we would be testing for a main effect for factor A. That would be asking whether there were differences between the different levels, between the different types of treatment. And the null hypothesis there is simply that all of those means are equal to each other. Or I could have written A1 is equal to A2 is equal to A3. That might be a little more correct. The test of the null hypothesis here examines differences between the overall means, control versus cognitive behavioral versus psychotherapy, regardless of whether it was short-term or long-term. That's just like what we did with a one-factor ANOVA. It's the same type of approach. Main effect for factor B, length of treatment. Are there differences between long and short-term therapies? Again, comparing those two therapy means, again, this could be better noted as mu B1, mu B2. And here we're testing differences between the overall means between long-term and short-term, regardless of the type of therapy that it was. So these are ignoring those other factors. The interaction effect, interaction between therapy type and length. Interestingly, the null hypothesis is always simply there is no interaction. The reason why is it's impossible to specify that in any way that's not horribly complicated mathematically. The best question there is, do the different therapies work differently depending upon length? That can take a lot of different forms. It could be the case that cognitive behavioral therapy, well, I know this, cognitive behavioral therapy will work well in both short and long-term formats. However, psychodynamic theory only works with long-term. So when we ask questions like, hey, does psychodynamic theory help? Well, it depends. What does it depend on? It depends on the length of treatment. And that's where we get that idea of the interaction coming in. As a graphical example, we might get something that looks like this. The control group, people are at 50, whether they measure them 3 weeks later or 10 weeks later. Cognitive behavioral therapy, at 3 weeks, they got down to 20, and then they stayed. And for the 10-week group, they were also got down to 20. Where we see the interaction is where we see psychodynamic. For psychodynamic theory, it depends whether it was short-term or long-term. For the control group and for cognitive behavioral therapy, we saw no effect of the length of treatment, but length of treatment does make a difference for psychodynamic. Doesn't work short-term, does work long-term. Now, that's kind of the heart of the way that we can look for interactions, at least graphically, is we want to move from left to right on the graph and ask, is the same pattern going on? Is the effect of factor B at each of the levels of factor A the same? Is the effect of length of treatment the same for control, cognitive behavioral therapy, and psychodynamic theory. It is the same for the first two, but for the last one, we see a very different effect where long-term is better. And that's really the key to an interaction. It's not attributable to the type of therapy. It's not attributable just to the length of the therapy. It's the combination of the two. All right, when we talk about main effects, what we're looking at is the overall means here for the control group, cognitive behavioral therapy, and psychodynamic. That's what's getting compared there. And one thing we can see here is the mean for that psychodynamic group, it's kind of affected by the things that are making the interaction happen. So we want to take care when we're interpreting main effects when we have an interaction, because sometimes those main effects kind of make what we would say, either those interactions kind of make what we would say about the main effects a little bit less relevant. The effect for length, that would just be the blue bars, or I know some people can't see. Wait, is it blue and red or blue or green? Regardless, the bars on the left are the short term. They have a mean of 40. The bars on the right are the long term. They have a mean of 35. Now it's interesting. That's a relatively small difference between the short and the long term. But we wouldn't say that. We really wouldn't want to say that the length of treatment doesn't matter. It does matter, but it only matters for psychodynamic theory. Again, it depends, just like everything in psychology. And then the interaction, good question to ask graphically, are the differences for the control group in terms of the short versus the long term the same as they are for cognitive behavioral therapy, the same as they are for psychodynamic therapy? All right, another example where we can tease out whether we have main effects or interactions. And I'll bring in some more numbers here. Video game play, frustration level, and aggression. This is a hypothetical study examining type of video game played, either a violent or a non-violent game, level of the participants' frustration. This can be induced in a number of ways. Usually you give them you give them something that's got a little bit of a delay so they can't perform as well as they might think. And dependent variable, duration of a white noise blast after playing the game with a partner. So again, the special thing about this design is that if you were to study these individually, you might have 200 people playing a violent game, 200 people playing a non-violent game. You could get one question answered. Might do another study with frustration. You might do something with another study looking at frustration, use up another 200 people for 400 participants total. However, with the factorial design, you can answer those two questions that you answered before, having 100 people in each of the groups, but now you can do this with only 200 people overall, and as a bonus, you get to ask questions about the interaction. All right, so what effects and factors do we have? Effective factor A, video game violence. Main effect, the difference between the violent and the non-violent games overall. Factor B, frustration level. Main effect, difference between the frustrated and the not frustrated.